Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 14th of February of 2026. Today we have a lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first, let's talk once again about the Munich Security Conference. Today is the second day of this conference, and today Zelensky made lots of statements about the situation in Ukraine. Zelensky stated that we, the Ukrainians, truly hope that the trilateral meetings next week will be serious and substantive, helpful for us, for all of us. But honestly, sometimes it feels like the sides are talking about completely different things. Another important thing, the Americans often return to the topic of concessions, and too often those concessions are discussed only in the context of what Ukraine should give, not Russia. Europe is practically not present at the table. That is a big mistake in my view, it truly is. We Ukrainians are trying to bring you fully into the process so that Europe's interests and voice are taken into account. Another important thing, the Ukrainian army is the strongest army in Europe thanks to the Ukrainian soldiers. And probably this is the only thing I can agree with Zelensky. Indeed, the Ukrainian army currently is the strongest army when talking about NATO probably and the European Union. Ukraine is ready for a deal on one thing that brings the real peace to Ukraine and Europe. I'm confident that this year war can be ended and ended with dignity. So as you can see, he is confident that war can be ended, but not 100% sure the war will be finished during this year. If you ask my opinion, I think that according to the current situation, according to everything that we can see right now, what is happening along the line of combat contact, it seems that the war will be prolonged for the next 2027. But as of the 2026 and as of the current situation on the ground, you know that we see these days something new in the conflict. You know that during the special military operation, during the conflict in Ukraine, almost every single year we have a general battle. We had the general battle in 2022, and that was the Kharkiv counter-offensive operation that started in the late autumn in the early autumn of 2022. Then we saw, and it was the beginning, the second general battle of 2022 was the beginning of the battle for the city of Bakhmut. This battle also started in 2022, but also in the late 2022, so we had two general battles. In 2023, the Russians began the Avdiivka general battle that started in the late 2023 and was completed in 2024. As for the 2024, we had also a general battle, but now I'm not sure what exactly was in 2024. In 2024 was the battle for the Sudzha. So the Russians launched their Sudzha counter-offensive operation in the late 2024 and finished that battle in the beginning of 2025. And when talking about 2025, there was another general battle that started in the end of the year, and we are talking about the battle for the cities of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. So as you can see, every single year we have a general battle, and almost every single year this general battle starts in the end of the year and ends at the beginning of the next year. But the thing is that 2026 is completely different, because according to my understanding of the situation, according to everything that is coming from the line of combat contact, the general battle of the 2026 started at the beginning of the year. And of course, we are talking about the battle for the eastern Zaporizhzhia flank. The Russians, by the end of 2025, managed to improve their position significantly. Basically, the Russians captured lots of territories to the west of Velika Novoselovka. Furthermore, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement of Gulay-Polya. The Russians crossed the river of Gaichur, and the Russians improved their positions through the next defense line, we can say already deep inside of the Ukrainian Ukrainian side of the river of Gaichur. But at the beginning of 2026, the Ukrainians launched a counter-offensive operation. And during the first days of this counter-offensive operation, some sources reported that there is no counter-attack from the Ukrainian side. Some sources reported that the Ukrainians managed to improve their position significantly. One thing we have right now for sure is that the Russians were cut off from the Starlink system. So that is why we don't know for sure what is happening right now in the Zaporizhzhia direction. And one thing, this offensive operation, counter-offensive operation, started several days ago, and just now we start receiving first updates. And let's discuss everything that took place during the previous probably 24 or even 100 hours. Today, as you can see, the map has been adjusted. So this is the situation by the end of the 13th of February of 2026, and this is the situation by the end of the 14th of February. As you can see, as a result of a counter-offensive, the Ukrainians managed to improve their positions, but it's more correct to say that the Ukrainians infiltrated the Russian positions in this area and managed to approach the settlements of Kalinovskaya, Novomykolaivka, Berezova, and Ternova. Once again, these are the changes, and we added this gray zone based on the report that was published by pro-Ukrainian source. This morning, a pro-Ukrainian source adjusted its map by expanding additional gray zone in the southern direction. But this is not the end of the story. During the day, we received the first video that was published by pro-Russian sources, and here we can see several moments of this northern Ukrainian counter-offensive operation. In this video, we can see how Ukrainians managed to enter the territory that used to be under control of the armored forces of the Russian Federation. Here we can see how the Ukrainians continued sending their vehicles further in the southern direction, and here we can see how the Russians were attacking the vehicles of the armored forces of Ukraine with FPV drones. So, for example, this vehicle that you can see in front of your screens was attacked by Russians right exactly at this point. So, what is happening right now? Right now, the Ukrainians are not pushing the front line. The Russians is the only side who are pushing the front line. The Ukrainians are trying to maneuver. So now the Ukrainians are trying to do everything that we used to see during the Zaporizhzhia offensive operation that started in 2024 from the Ukrainian side. If you remember, the Ukrainians didn't push the front line. The Ukrainians launched dozens of fast lightning attacks, and every single group of those fast lightning attacks had purposes. They were tasked to move as deep as possible. They were tasked to capture some strongholds, checkpoints, temporary deployment points, tree lines, fortifications. Those were the tasks of mobile assault groups. They were moving and moving and moving, and their task was to move as deep as possible until they face a resistance from the Russian side. And when they face a resistance, their task was to stop and to dig in deeper. So this is what the Ukrainians were doing during the 2024 Zaporizhzhia offensive operation. So now the Ukrainians are doing the same. And the Russians, what is the difference with the Russian tactics? The Russians are moving like a wall, like a press. They're pushing using broad frontline attack, using chains. They're pushing, and if they see the resistance, they're not trying to maneuver or to outflank this pocket or this island of resistance. They're not moving further until they destroy this pocket of resistance. So this is the main difference. So right now the Ukrainians are doing the same. They launched their offensive operation from the villages of Velika Mikhailovka. Most likely the Ukrainians outflanked the settlements of Sosnovka. Most likely the Ukrainians outflanked this stronghold. Most likely the Ukrainians outflanked these two strongholds and managed to get this point where they were attacked by a drone, by the Russian drone, and they were forced to stop. Here we can see the same story. The Ukrainians most likely launched their offensive operation from Pokrovsky. The Ukrainians outflanked the settlement of Gai, Novo-Alexandrovka. Then they moved further in the direction of Vishnyovo, where the Ukrainians once again outflanked these villages and continue advancing further in the southeastern direction with the purpose to cut the main lines, to take under control the main points, logistic points, and so on. So if you follow pro-Ukrainian mappers, you might see that lots of pro-Ukrainian mappers have already colored all these territories as the territories under complete control of the armored forces of Ukraine. So most of the mappers, pro-Ukrainian and probably pro-Western mappers, colored this territory with the yellow color, as if dozens or even thousands of Russian soldiers surrendered or disappeared just within a day. So this is not something that is happening right now in this area. The Ukrainians are trying to do everything that I have shown you right now on the map. At least this is my understanding of the situation. Maybe I'm wrong. Of course, I will tell you this in advance, but I see this like this. So the main task of Ukrainians is to establish complete control over this yellow line. Just over this yellow line. Maybe yellow line is the wrong understanding, the wrong explanation. It's better to describe this situation like this, to establish complete control over, let's call it like layer, over this yellow layer. It's a territory with the width of around, let's say, 2-4 kilometers. And so this is something like a corridor. They want to take under control this corridor by breaking through the Russians' defenses like this. And when they take these territories under complete control, the main forces of the armed forces of Ukraine will push the settlements that's occurred, encircled, and cut from the mainland from the Russian side. When the Ukrainians take these territories under control, they will start pushing and they will start attacking these Russian positions, the villages of Privili, Yegorovka, Vishneva, Nechaevka. So they're trying to create something like a cauldron by these maneuvers and by these multiple breakthroughs of the front line from the Russian side. And another important thing, another important piece of news that was published today by pro-Russian sources, and I've noted that most of the sources probably haven't noted this update. This information was published by pro-Russian sources. And this is the article that was published by pro-Russian source, and this is the translation. The 29th Guard Combined Arms Army of the Vostok Grouping Forces, the 11th Guards Air Force and Air Defense Army have been awarded the Order of Suvorov for mass heroism and valor, steadfastness and courage demonstrated by their personnel during the execution of combat missions in the special military operation zone. So how this article is related to the current situation. I would like to remind you that the 29th, the area of responsibilities of the 29th Army is located right exactly in this area. So the 29th Army of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation is located right exactly at this point. And the Russians, by this article, are trying to tell us that's when the Ukrainians launched their counter-offensive operation, and when this army was probably even encircled from many directions with the armed forces of Ukraine, this army didn't fall back. This army decided to stay on their positions, and they're currently standing on their positions. Most likely they're suffering huge losses, and most likely they are forced to show mass heroism and valor, steadfastness, being encircled completely by the armed forces of Ukraine. This is most likely the current situation, but they are still fighting. So this is the situation on the ground. Of course, let's wait and see what is going to be next. But once again, I would like to point attention that this is the general battle of the 2026. If Russians lose this general battle that started at the beginning of the year, most likely they will be forced to change their plans regarding the siege of Zaporizhzhia and to postpone the offensive operation in this area probably until 2027. But if the Russians are able to win this Zaporizhzhia major battle, then most likely they will begin moving much faster in the western direction. Another important question I have: why the Russians are not using aviation, why the Russians are not launching their massive missiles and drone strikes in the direction of the siege of Zaporizhzhia? Because the main the main forces, the main reinforcements are coming from the river of Dnipro, from the cities along the river of Dnipro. So currently, to support this Ukraine's counter-offensive operation, the Ukrainians are using these two biggest cities in this area as a base. Everything goes exactly through this area. As reinforcements, reserves, arms, vehicles, wounded soldiers are returning back also to these cities, and the Russians right now are not doing anything. So this is a very important question, which means that the Russians are not doing not because they don't understand this. Most likely the Russians are waiting for something. Anyway, according to the information we have, according to media, according to different experts, the Russians have already finished the preparation of another large-scale combined missile and drone attack on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. These are the conclusions that were made by Western and neutral experts. If you ask my opinion, I believe that when Russians launch their another large-scale combined missile and drone attack, most likely the Russians will use hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles, and most likely the Russians will attack just one part of Ukraine, and most likely we are talking about this region. The Russians will try to attack everything they found in this direction with the purpose to stop the Ukrainian counteroffensive operation. The Russians will attack warehouses, ammo depots, oil refineries, oil depots, industrial zones, energy facilities, bridges, especially bridges. The Russians will try to attack through the entire territory just with one purpose: to ruin the plans of the Armored Forces Ukraine and the Commander-in-Chief of the Armored Forces Ukraine Syrsky in this Zaporizhzhia counteroffensive operation. If you ask my opinion, it seems that the Russians are allowing the Ukrainians to push in this area with the purpose to force Ukrainians to introduce as many as possible forces. This is also a very important thing because, for example, if Russians began repelling this counteroffensive operation from within the first minutes or hours when this offensive operation started, then the Ukrainians would stop this counteroffensive due to heavy losses or something like this. So the Russians are keeping this pressure, are keeping this very cold-blooded situation just with one purpose: to force the Ukrainians to introduce as many as possible forces. Because the more you forces Syrsky, the commander-in-chief of the Armored Forces Ukraine, introduces in this counter-offensive operation, most likely the Russians believe the more losses they will suffer, and then it will be the situation when at some point the Ukrainians may start feeling and suffering huge shortage in manpower due to the complete exhaustion during the battle for the Zaporizhzhia region. Anyway, as of now, it's too early to make any conclusions, but we need to wait. But I would like to remind you another important thing, that several months ago, the Ukrainians launched the counter-offensive operation in the area of the city of Kupyansk, and during those battles, the Ukrainians managed to improve their position significantly and almost to recapture the entire city and the entire northern direction. But later, Ukrainians, when they reached some certain point, they stopped and they probably retreated, or they stopped, or something like this. And then the Russians, with new forces, with fresh forces, began a new wave of attacks, and now the Russians are about to establish complete control over this territory. So everything is possible here. The Russians, as a result of these Ukrainian counterattacks, can retreat even further in the southern direction, almost till the settlement of Kupyansk and so on, almost till this defense layer. The question is what the Ukrainians are going to do with this, and whether the Ukrainians are able to save control over these territories they are trying to take right now under complete control. So let's wait. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Dnipropetrovsk direction. During the previous 12 hours, we have changes on the ground. These are the changes on the ground that were provided by pro-Ukrainian sources. According to them, the Russians began advancing between the villages of Novomikhailivka and Novopidgorodne. Most likely the Russians are trying to outflank both fortified areas and to attack the Ukrainians from behind. So we believe that we need to keep an eye in this area, because a local breakthrough can occur in this area, and from these positions the Russians may attack and can attack in the direction of Mizhova and to encircle the armed forces of Ukraine to the north of the settlement of Novopavlovka. So this is a very interesting update. Another important area is the Slaviansk direction. During the previous 24 hours, additional changes on the ground were recorded. This is the end of the 13th of February and this is the end of the 14th of February. According to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians are about to finish the battle for the first defense layer along MO3 road. And there are just one small forest left before the Russians finish the battle for this territory, and then the Russians will keep advancing further in the northern direction towards the settlement of Fedorov-Godruga, and they will attack this territory from the west. Another important advance progress on the ground was recorded to the south of the settlement of Zakitne. Pro-Ukrainian sources reported that Russians infiltrated this territory. Currently, there are lots of sabotage and reconnaissance groups of the armed forces of the Russian Federation that are trying to keep advancing further in the southern direction. And I would like to remind you that this is the most important defense layer of the armed forces of Ukraine to the east of the city of Slaviansk. There are strategical elevations, the settlement of Krivo Luka. If Ukrainians lose control over this territory, most likely they will not be able to hold their positions almost until the settlements of Alexandrovka and Nikolaevka. As for the northern directions, the sources reported, mainly pro-Russian sources reported, that the armed forces of the Russian Federation improved their positions significantly along the border between the villages of Zeleny and Niskuchna. These are the changes on the ground. The Russians are keeping advancing further in the southern direction towards the settlement of Veselya, and it seems that the Russians are tasked to cut the road between the settlements of Liptsy, Tirunovo and further in the Volchansk direction, so they're trying to ruin the Ukraine's logistics in this area and to isolate this huge forest. So Russians will keep advancing further in the southern direction, and then most likely the Russians will turn their offensive operation towards the settlements of Piramoga and Ukrainka, and with these positions the Russians will try to isolate this huge forest, which is under complete control of the armed forces of Ukraine. And telling the truth, it is very dangerous if the Russians decide to storm this forest from the north. Let's say in front, it's the Russians decided to outflank this territory and to attack the Ukrainians from behind and to cut the main supply lines that go in the direction of this fortified area. So Russians with these offensives will try to unite these two footholds around the city of Liptsy and the city of Volchansk. This will create a very powerful foothold for the armed forces of the Russian Federation, and basically with this advance the Russians would be around to completely restore the territories the Russians lost during the Ukraine's Kharkiv counteroffensive operation that took place in 2022. So lots of updates, lots of things, and during the next few days the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Americans will hold talks trilateral meetings on the territory of Geneva, when they will once again discuss and decide how to settle the conflict peacefully. But most likely the parties will not be able to find a solution, especially after everything that Zelensky stated during the Munich Security Conference. And that's it for today. The Military Summary channel reminds that we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.